Thank you very much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here, and I thought, apropos of the local feast day, I might begin with a metaphor. Yesterday was St. George's Day, when St. George killed the dragon. And today I'd like to describe a dragon that is killing us, and it's the dragon of ignorance, and it relates to the entire question of innovation and entrepreneurship. Now, as the professor suggested, for 10 years I ran the Kauffman Foundation, and the great part of that job, as far as I was concerned, as a former professor who had become a businessman entrepreneur, was we had sufficient monies to do research. Now, research had never been done in any consequential way on entrepreneurship. It had been done, and I don't mean this as a particular diminishment of people who are business professors, but it had been done in business schools in the case study method. My background as an economist doesn't pay much attention to case studies. We look at big data sets and attempt to describe phenomena that can be established statistically or empirically. It's quite different as a form of epistemology from case studies. So one of the first things I want you to take away today is that we're going to try and look at the phenomena of entrepreneurship and innovation from the perspective of empirical large data sets as opposed to case studies. And this is central because much of what we think about when we go about trying to stimulate innovation or more new firm creation, entrepreneurship, is the study of cases. So many people, for example, go to the Silicon Valley engaged in case studies. They come home often with entirely the wrong lessons. Believe me, my office used to be in Kansas City. We were the stop between often Europe and the Silicon Valley. Generally, people were going backward from the Silicon Valley, stopped to talk to us on their way to the State Department, if you can imagine that, and then return to Europe. And I would always say, and what did you learn? And they said, when we go back to Latvia, we need to have an indigenous venture capital industry. That's the missing part of our, quote, ecosystem. And had I a gun in my desk, I would have shot myself every time, okay? If I had an army, I would have sent it to the Silicon Valley. And if I was really in control, I wouldn't let anybody in. So they would take away the wrong message. So with that in mind, I want to talk to you about several of what I believe are the breaking points in what we understand, if you'll come with me along with the view of Thomas Kuhn, that when paradigms break, they break because some of the empirical evidence won't enforce that which we believe. Many years ago as an undergraduate, I took a course in the history of science, and for some reason, these words continue to echo in my head from Herbert Butterfield, great historian of science at Cambridge. Innovations happen by people picking up the stick from the other end. So today I want to talk to you about picking up the stick from the other end. But first we have to understand why the stick has to be picked up from the other end. And here's where I want to start. If we look at the data, just in the United States, but the data that exists around the world all points in the same direction. The number of new firms we're creating is going down. And it's going down rather rapidly, particularly in the last 6-7 years. Now, you could say that's the Great Recession, but it's larger than that. And let me suggest to you one reason we're going to fool around with that stick on the ground, and it goes like this. There's an inverse correlation between the number of professors teaching entrepreneurship and the new firms being formed. So if we had a chart, we would watch, listen to these numbers. In 1990, we had fewer than 100 professors purporting to teach business starting, entrepreneurship in the United States. 1990. Today we have about 6,000. Now, in the last few years, we have gone from a steady state back as far as we measured, about 700,000 new firms started in the United States that employ at least one person in their first year. These are our startups that count. These are the ones that we know historically have scale possibility. And that number has dropped from 700,000 to less than 500,000 in the last 6 years. So you could be cute, as I try to be from time to time, and say, what is this? The more professors of entrepreneurship we deploy, the fewer businesses we start. And the evidence, I think, is clear. But now if I were a normal professor, I'd say, great. It's obvious we have to deploy yet more professors of entrepreneurship, right? But what I'd like to suggest is perhaps we're teaching the wrong thing. And what I think in the new book I'm writing, which is not surprisingly called Burn the Business Plan, I think what we're doing is we're way over teaching business starting technique and way, way under teaching how innovation happens. And isn't that normal? It's a human response. We always find it easier to teach the easy stuff and very much more difficult to think about the harder stuff. And if I say to you right now, you have a choice today in the classroom, where will you feel more comfortable? You can teach the canon of how to write a business plan, or you can go in and teach people how to innovate. And the reality is you would all choose how to write a business plan, because that's how we do it. Incidentally, just to point this out, the canonical business plan is 11 points. It always ends with an exit strategy. So before you even birth your child, you're figuring out how to get rid of it. Okay? Now think about this. Only people who do case studies could come up with this. It's a narrative that business ought to look like this. There's a marvelous Italian phrase which goes, se non è vero, è ben trovato. Okay? If it's not true, it should be. Now, the other end of it is, we're going to start a new business. 6,000 professors teach this all the time in the United States. We're going to start a new business. A new business. Think of it. A change in your life. A new business. Now, your first task is to write an essay. That's the business plan. And here's the empirical trouble that invades. If we look at all of our fast-growing businesses in the United States, our 500 fastest-growing businesses in the United States, fewer than 40% ever wrote a business plan. There's no business plan for Microsoft or Apple. There's no business plan for Twitter. There was no business plan for Intel or Cisco. Companies start without business plans. I've started 6 companies and have yet to write a business plan. I currently have 10 investments in companies. I've never read a business plan. So we make a canonical, almost a liturgical event out of this business plan, when in fact, what's the key to any business is its innovation. And in fact, what I will argue in my new book, out next year from Simon & Schuster, for those of you who want to is that in fact, there are only 2 forces that count when we conceive of a business. The first is what I call scalable innovation. And the second is entrepreneurial competency. So now we are right back to where I spoke about your hypothetical, which one of these 2 classes would you like to teach? We would all default to entrepreneurial competency. Huge amount of literature on that. Few of us would say, oh, I'll go teach innovation. It's much more difficult. And incidentally, the literature about what innovation is that is any way actionable is almost non-existent. Believe me. I've just finished a meta-analysis of over 1,000 papers and 150 books. And these are the books like Disruptive Innovation and Open Innovation and whatnot. And here's what you find. If in fact you want to teach how innovation works, these papers are largely useless. They talk about how innovation disrupts, how you can use innovation as a business weapon, how innovation is important to economic growth, what you should do to sort of structure a more innovative company. A book is called 101 Steps to Make Your Company More Innovative. Or you can read the brand new book about IDEO, which is filled with the word ideation. Of course you feel fulfilled. You now know a new word, ideation. What does it mean? The book doesn't tell you. But the book does tell you three things. If you put smart people in a room and keep them there without food for 2-hour periods of time and give them intense pressure to do something innovative, step back and watch how great they become. That's what the book says, right? Now, if you're running IBM, somebody here is in Zurich who's in charge of innovation in IBM, you know that's a diet without any substance. You can't do that. And we all have a hunch that this isn't right, because we all have a hunch that there are many paths to innovation. And let me talk about them, the effective paths to innovation. So if in fact you're caught having to teach innovation, here's at least a little framework with which to teach. You can get through the first hour looking smart, okay? There are about 5 or 6 courses or sources of innovation. The first is tinkering. Now, in universities, we're very upset about tinkering because that's what guys do at workshops. We have a vision of maybe Henry Ford cutting gears. But tinkering is hugely important, as anybody who's a bench scientist appreciates, because many bench scientists do their best tinkering making tools and making instrumentation. So tinkering is very important, never weighted sufficiently. Second, of course, is accidental, where we pay a huge amount of attention. Literature is all over the place on accidental. That somehow things happen, and people wisely see that one of my favorite examples is Goodyear, who throws some rubber into the fireplace at the end of the day, and it comes in the morning and finds it's hardened, and voila, we have discovered vulcanized rubber, right? And the same happens with Lexon and all kinds of things. But any significant innovation doesn't happen this way. That's how we discovered aspirin. But it doesn't happen, and you can't stage it, even if it is, because recall the operative word I'm talking about here is actionable. You can't stage for accident. The third, of course, is purpose-driven research. This is what we're talking about when we talk about the investment in Catalonia or in the United States with NIH or the Defense Department. And there are two great forces of purpose-driven research. One is warfare, which we, of course, would like to doll up and say it's defense. But it's either defending ourselves or conquest. It's warfare. And while that makes us nervous as academics, the reality is tremendous amounts of non-warfare related research spill out. It's the peripherals of this warfare that's been so important in making all of our lives easier. I came here in a taxi with GPS, and GPS would not exist but for Allied Signal being commissioned to make better bombs. Better bombs find where they're supposed to go, hence GPS. Now, the second purpose-driven area is medicine. And in both cases, they reflect very fundamental characteristics of human nature. We don't want anybody taking us over. We want to protect our security, and we don't want to die. But these are the two purpose-driven forces. And when I say purpose-driven, they're fundamentally paid for by the state, everywhere. A fourth force is pure science, which is also paid for by the state. And pure science is that which we as academics wrap ourselves around very tightly. We defend it against politicians because politicians say we don't get any return on it. And every professor is adept at saying, yes, yes, but you don't understand how this works. And the reality is pure science is, in fact, very important to innovation. But the fifth source of innovation is often very, very much devalued in the academic world, including the business school world, and that is linear progress. Almost 90% of our innovation happens by linear descent from what already exists, and in factories and in companies and in laboratories, trying to make it happen better or faster or cheaper. And this, by the way, opens a window on how we begin to think about how we would improve a really improved ecosystem. Because it's important to know where these sources of innovation come from. Much public policy is fabricated with a vision that pure science is the only way. Others argue that, in fact, the most important parts are defense spending and NIH spending. And we don't have a comprehensive, intelligible window on exactly where this innovation comes from. And this is central if we want more new businesses. And the reason we want more new businesses is because it's the new businesses that fire the economy and make economic growth. So in a sense, this is the holistic vision of why it is that we're interested in innovation and then entrepreneurship, because it leads to economic growth and obviously the expansion of human welfare. So now the question comes to us, so what do we do to increase the amount of business formation and innovation? And again, I will take you back to the central tenet that I argue, that business formation is in fact much more a function of true innovation. Now let's pause there for a moment, because we've already heard the word ecosystem. And in many universities, ecosystem means incubator, among other things. But it becomes the firmament around which an ecosystem can be built. Without the ecosystem, we can't think of how we vocabularize to venture capitalists, for example. And we can't think about what it is we physically do with students who articulate an interest in starting a business. But the reality is, if we look at many of our incubators in the United States, they are performing horribly, so badly that we have to question whether or not they should exist, or if they exist, how we restructure them. Anybody like myself who's been a judge in a business plan competition, here's perhaps 9 out of 10 ideas that if you've been a true businessman, and even if you're an intellectual businessman, as I am, you have to say this idea couldn't possibly work. This is not like pure science. How would you know it wouldn't work? Because everything in experience says it couldn't work, but most importantly, there's no innovation there. And this is the test at which we as a society, we as academics, are doing very, very poorly. What is a real innovation? How do we induce real innovation? And more importantly, how do we discuss this in terms of scalable innovation? Now, these are the hard questions, and I would suggest we avoid them. In fact, let me suggest to you how rigorously we avoid them. Because innovation appears to be dropping, or at least one indicia of it is, new firms, in the United States we have now established a rigorous debate about whether or not anybody needs to innovate again. Robert Gordon at Northwestern has written a very controversial paper that says we've come to the end of human innovation. If we think about it, as the human species, what more do we need? We've conquered leukemia. We move ourselves around the world, 1 or 2% of us every day at 600 miles an hour, 5 miles above the earth. We're all living tremendously longer. What more innovation can there be? We have a cell phone, right? This appendage to our anatomy that, in only a few years ago we thought we could talk to our mom with this, right? And now, of course, it's turned into a communications platform which outperforms our computers of only a few years ago. And God knows where this is headed. See mine? See those 2 things there? At any given moment, if you are interested, I can take my EKG and send it to my doctor. Hoo-ha. This is not going to make me live longer, but we're all inundated with more knowledge. The point is, it's a communicating platform. But once we have this, and we can communicate 24/7 nonstop with everybody else on Earth, what more do we need? So Robert Gordon argues that there will be no more significant innovation. And if you pause for a moment, this question has to trouble you. Is there more innovation to come? We have to take a leap of faith if we say yes. It's much more safe to basically side with an economist who says it's all over. Tyler Cowen also has written a new book which basically says the new average. And the new average is basically no more radical innovation. Now, how many of you believe that? I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, But how many of you are troubled by that? And in a sense, what you're troubled by is your own inability at this very moment to think up the real innovative frontier. Now, I would argue that as we wind back the clock, the people who did the huge innovative frontiers on a given morning in Barcelona didn't see the frontier they were about to step off. I myself have not invested in this notion that we're at the end of innovation. I can't even conceive of it. Because, in many ways, you could argue that innovation is moving faster than ever. The cell phone came upon us much faster than the railroad. The cell phone came upon us much faster than our urge to go faster in an airplane. The cell phone came upon us much faster than our competency to cut gears precisely, which was important to the bicycle, and then to the car, and then to the airplane, and then to interplanetary movement. So it's very hard to have a sense, at least if you're thinking about the future, to think that we're at the end of innovation. But it's a comfortable detour when we see innovation rates falling off and we don't know what to do about it. So the balance of my few minutes of remark is actually to talk to us about what we should do about it. Because in this room are assembled, as there are in rooms around the world from time to time, the people who are supposed to know what the future is. And more importantly, many of you are commissioned by society, are supported by society to go invent the future, to innovate. I'm connected to several universities. My presumption is society supports me as a professor because it wants me to contribute to the bolus of knowledge. Luck would have it, or fate would have it, or perhaps I'm cursed with, having to struggle with this question of innovation. It'd be a lot easier to teach Latin. Nobody expects innovation in Latin teaching, right? But I'm writing a book on innovation. I'm writing a book that's critical of how we start businesses. Now, E.A. Wilson recently said, there's nothing quite as rewarding as blowing up a theory if you have an alternative to put in place. And of course, this is what Thomas Kuhn told us, that the paradigms develop when sufficient counter-evidence begins to accumulate that we can no longer buy into, accept, or advance the old theory. So let me start with what we do about business planning and get back to innovation. So business planning essentially tells us that we're going to break our life off. We're not going to go forward with life. We're going to go into an incubator. We're going to write an extensive 60, 70, 80-page document about a business that we haven't started yet. Now, you should all be troubled, because if this was the task confronting you, it means you're going to stop working where you are, and you're going to write a hypothetical, almost a novel, about your life to come. And it's going to be largely uninformed, except by a lot of case studies that were once presented to you in books or by professors of business. And what they won't talk to you about is a test of whether or not the innovation you're about to be married to as the basis of your business is going to be scalable. This is the real fundamental problem. Now, how would I attack this problem? First, I would suggest that we are putting probably 8 times as many people into incubators as belong there. If you don't have a scalable innovation, you should do something else. Now, why do I say that? Think of our model. Our model is the Mozart model. People who go into incubators are how old? You can't find anybody 25 or older in an incubator. We put students in incubators. Our vision is that people create businesses when they're young, scalable businesses when they're young. This is part of what people take mistakenly from the Silicon Valley. The reality, the empirical reality, is people who start big businesses, successful businesses, fast-growing businesses, are 40 years old in the United States, That's how old they are when they start their businesses. So what in heaven's name are we doing except keeping people out of the labor market when we put all these youngsters into incubators? And incidentally, the social theory of incubators, if they're proximate to each other, they'll help each other out with good ideas. If they play foosball together, more brilliant ideas will come out. You've seen this archetype throughout every portrayal of how incubation happens and entrepreneurship happens. I would largely suggest to you that most entrepreneurs who are successful are particularly isolated people. Starting a business is a particularly solitary effort. And having a huge amount of social distraction, no matter how we justify it as thick social network, doesn't yield new big business. And what would we do with people who want to be an entrepreneur? Now imagine, what I'm also talking about is now people say, as an occupational determination, I want to be an entrepreneur. Do you have an idea? No. That's all right. Come right in. We'll sign you up for our major. The world doesn't work this way. An occupational category entrepreneur? So if you have a degree in this, you're going to get a job with somebody? I haven't seen an advertisement. IBM needs new entrepreneurs. Sign up. That's not how it works. Moreover, the skill set you learn is not particularly adaptable to becoming a social worker or a scientist. We would do, in fact, much better taking the people who say, I'd like to be an entrepreneur, and telling them to major in biology. So what should we do with these folks? We should look at what reality says and say, prepare for the moment when it could happen. On average, it'll happen at 40. In fact, our population curve shows it keeps attenuating and becoming later stage phenomena. Now it's going to happen. 70% of kids in college hope to start a business, and some large number of those people will, in fact, quit their jobs or be released from their jobs and, in fact, start businesses. So all we need to do is open the window that this is likely to happen. And when it happens, these are the pragmatic steps to take. But the central question of when this is likely to happen is absolutely coincident with when you are in your life at the age of 30 and have a great scalable idea. And that takes us again to this question of innovation, as if innovation, like starting businesses, happens on a biological time frame or calendar, which contravenes all of our common sense and the experience of everybody in this room. Many of you have had your great idea when you were 32, likely in the shower, okay, or when the dog was barking, all right, or when your spouse was telling you you had bought the wrong thing in the grocery store. Leo Szilard had the idea for the atom bomb stepping off the curb in a London street. He was not 19. He was well along, already a distinguished physicist. This is how innovation happens, and that's when a commitment to start the business should occur. So what do we do with all this human talent that we know should go in this direction, that we want to encourage in this direction? What do we do when they're 21? The single most pragmatic piece of advice we could give somebody is take a job in a technology company. Remember, I said 90% of our true innovation descends from existing technology that is advanced by linear progression. It's the guy on the assembly line who says, if we had a better tool, we could make this faster or better or cheaper. It's the person who has a great idea, like the folks who created global positioning, who walk out of a bomb factory because they see that the real question isn't making bombs, it's getting bombs to precisely where they ought to be. And it's conversion of that technology got me from downtown Barcelona to here on the shortest route, understanding what the traffic was along the way. Imagine this. But that idea occurred to two people I know who are in their late 40s. And this brings me to the last point in terms of how we accelerate innovation in the society. Our existing businesses are horrific at engendering new technology. And what happened in the case of Garmin with GPS is a phenomenon that I refer to as fissioning. The company that owned the intellectual property had no clue what it was when they spoke, these innovators, to their bosses. Those bosses invited them to leave the company, and in fact put at risk this technology to two guys who had never started a business and never taken an entrepreneurship course. Our companies have to become much, much better at what I call fusioning, encouraging people, in many cases, to start businesses within the net of the company. And in a sense, what I'm describing to you is a completely different vision of what an entrepreneurial ecosystem ought to be like. Now, where does this fit with the university? Because our central question in this audience is people who come from companies and people who come from universities, and our objective today is increase the quality and the effectiveness of that dialogue. So in a synopsis, what I want to say is, first, we have to question very thoroughly, and I would suggest disturb profoundly, how it is we think about the calendar of innovation in people's lives, what people are taught to be ready for when an idea happens, how we in fact communicate between companies, which are more critical to this than people expect, but they're actually more critical on the donor side as opposed to the receiver side. So in a sense, what I'm suggesting is our industry-university dialogue be restructured profoundly, understanding that on one side, the university side, not all truth resides, and the particular exhibit of innovation is not necessarily there. That innovation is a conjoint effort where both parties have to understand the strengths they bring to the table. Point one. Point two, we have to see to continued financing, be it from government or universities, of fundamental basic research. But the most effective fundamental basic research is that which is purpose-driven. It is around warfare or defense. It is around medicine. But we have other areas that we have yet to stake out as areas of big research funding. I would suggest to you one of them is nutrition, for all the reasons that all of you know about demographically. A fourth comes from medicine, but is given very short shrift, and that's communicable disease. It is a handmaiden of nutrition, and as the world population grows, as wealth grows in the world, and we watch a diet shift from carbohydrates to protein, these become fundamental, huge questions that should be the object of purpose-driven research. Finally, we have to come to a view of what it is that innovation is, as it is in fact yeasted and encouraged in individuals. We have yet to figure out how to teach how innovation happens. We take it as a given. If we throw more money into laboratories, if we make the groundwork more congenial for accident, if we teach more PhDs, basic research, it will happen more frequently. All that may be true, but our objective ought to make it absolutely true, and not only absolutely true, we should be able to anticipate increasing the propensity and the likelihood, the probability that more large-scale innovations will happen. That, I think, is our fundamental question. So if I had one thing to leave with you, it would be a view that we have to rethink how it is we conceive of how businesses start, overweight the notion of how important innovation is to every new business, It's not the business of writing business plans and going through the motions and making the liturgy of business starting. No, it is in fact creating consequential, scalable innovation. And lastly, I want to encourage you that you must reset this dialogue in terms of the supposed competency of the actors. Inside universities where I live, we always default to the view that it's our responsibility to think it up and then to somehow try and impregnate industry on the other side, which just doesn't get us. And in many ways, it may be that the adult in the room has to be industry that structures the conversation and a reasonable set of expectations and never devalues its own capacity to contribute to this. Again, the emphasis is that over 90% of our true innovation descends from linear progress of things that we're already doing, and most of that is done in companies. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Schramm. Very enlightening and a lot of different truths. Well, we have a little bit of time for questions from the audience. If you would like to ask Carl some questions, maybe I can misuse my role as a moderator for a first question. I hate people coming into my university from Chamber of Commerce, from the government, from the banks, standing there on stage saying to the students, you need to to create a new business, you need to take risks, it's your role for our future, for the country's future. I kick them out because this is not the right way of doing it. But you take it as given that, and the figure was 70% of people are willing or to create their own business. And looking at Germany or Europe, this is not really the case. So we have a much more lower percentage of people, if we ask them, students, do you want to be an entrepreneur in a later stage or something? So how can we get the passion or the sensitivity to really maybe want to be an entrepreneur into people's head rather than the mechanisms of creating a business? How can we get students or people in general more sensitive to be willing to create their own business?
That's a very difficult question. Now, I know the data that you speak of, and there is, and it's not just reported data that is data for data's sake, it really reflects reality. The difference in terms of the anticipation of working for oneself and starting a business between Europe on average and the United States on average is really profound. In the United States, many, many more people anticipate working for themselves, although of late the data begins to shift where I think a troubling number of people want to work for the government in later life. Now, my own view as an economist is that that's related to the current recession because it is so much easier to take risk when unemployment is at 5% than when it's effectively at 14%. You know, when you start a business and you have a failure, but you can still get a job, your risk is much, much lower. And it may be that slow growth and high unemployment is one factor in Europe. I don't think that's probably the explanatory variable. And if you hear passion in my voice about this matter, it is in the United States, which in fact we do play an important role. When students visit us, they get a sense of what this excitement is about starting a business. But as that begins to fall off, I think our responsibility to the world is falling off in that regard. So I guess what I can say is, you know, even in the United States, we have folks who show up in school who encourage people. It's always interesting to me when bankers say you should take a risk and start a business. There's no self-interest there, right? Coming from a banker, now there's a risk-taking individual, right? it's even worse when somebody comes out from the Commerce Department and says, you should start a business, right? And you ask their historic record, and they began as a postal inspector, and then they worked for the Agriculture Department, and now they're haranguing you in a university classroom to start a business. There's a real risk taker, okay? So I'm afraid I've avoided your question, but you've asked a great question, and it actually ought to be one that we begin to focus on. The problem is, I don't think if we could send every student in Europe to the Silicon Valley, they'd all come back with their brains changed. Because I think our narrative in the Silicon Valley is erroneous.
Thanks. We open up for some questions from the audience. We have flying mics. So if you want to put a question, somebody will come and hand over the mic to you, microphone to you.
Thank you very much. Humberto Merit from Mexico. It's a common wisdom that probably in the United States, your culture is prone to risk in some sense. I mean, it's normally known that the entrepreneurs in the US are not afraid of losing or even failing in the terms of a new venture. Is that right?
I think it's exaggerated in a sense, and our risk capacity is greatly reduced at periods of great unemployment, which is what we have right now. So that surely was right in 1990. That was certainly right in the year 2000. I don't think it's quite as right now. And the data suggests to us that college graduates are more considering life as a bureaucrat. That only says to me one thing: I don't want to have any risk in my life, right? And much of what our social policy in the United States, the gentleman from Catalonia was able to make a comment, political, here comes one from me, okay? The more we attempt to look like a welfare state in the United States, the more we will suffer reductions in growth rates. And growth rates, we know, Kauffman Foundation research, okay, if there's one contribution we made of consequence to economics, it's the entrepreneurs that basically create the new jobs. One of the reasons we don't have new jobs is the falling rate of new companies starting. That clearly relates to the taste for risk in individual entrepreneurs. So your question's very well taken. And by the way, in the United States, I never speak about this, except that this is a failure of the United States to lead in the world. Because the economic reality of this is fewer businesses, less growth. And the formula works in the United States. It certainly works in China, which has studied the United States exceedingly well. And it certainly works in India and every other place that's actually achieved this enormous rate of growth. By the way, I was asked, do you think you can teach innovation? And that's always a difficult question, but it may be that the shift in innovative rates in China suggests to me, I'm not sure you can teach it, but it appears you can learn it.
Europe is actually starting to address the entrepreneurial issues, and they're addressing it at the bottom levels with some new instruments aimed at smaller companies. But interestingly, I think they must have been reading the paper you commented on earlier, where innovation is over, because they're now starting to be talking about disruptive as opposed to innovative. Do you think the emphasis is wrong?
Yes. I'll tell you, from my perspective, we have several issues with European vocabulary. I fight against them constantly. In the current administration, we have taken up entrepreneurship in our State Department. Is the right German phrase Gott in Himmel? Huh? God in heaven, right? Me comes to teach German, right? Anyway, the phrase small and medium enterprise has come across the sea and invaded our State Department. I believe that's because we want to seem like you guys and not use threatening language. The reality is the people who work in the State Department are all trained in schools of international relations, so words mean much more than content. In the United States, to the ear of a business person, small and medium enterprise suggests cute little firms that can't be big. It also suggests a Keynesian view, very much alive in the United States, that we will do anything to protect our big firms, our incumbent firms. And in the United States, we had an import from Austria, Joseph Schumpeter, who wrote the doctrine on this. And the job of the entrepreneur is to disrupt the giant incumbent firms. And as long as we have government policy that protects big firms, very much like your phrase in Europe, industrial policy, this is another reason we're having lower rates of business formation. So, of course, people would now say we're not having enough, so let's be disruptive. We'll find, and we'll get Professor Christensen to come over from Harvard and talk to us about disruptive innovation. Well, if you bought what I said, fundamentally, we don't know how to do innovation in the first place. Let's skip the hard question and talk about the characterization of some innovations. Of course, some are disruptive, but until professors can come and tell you how to make a disruptive innovation, it will be a hollow luncheon.
Well, thank you, Professor Carl Schramm. Great speech, very enlightening.
I'll be around all day.
All day?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yep.
Give him a hand, please. Thank you very much.